Hello, dear friends. I want to again thank Fuller Seminary for giving me the high honor of being allowed to offer the Peyton Lectures for this year. I want to again thank President Laberton and Dean Young and Dean Kosi for this wonderful opportunity to present these lectures. As a student at Fuller, I always looked forward to the Peyton Lectures, and what a thrill for me to be the one offering them this year. In our first lecture, we sought to reframe the trajectory of a Christian doctrine of creation by exploring the architecture of belief that the God of Israel is our creator and has revealed through Jesus the goal of homemaking. The Spirit of God has aimed us toward homemaking by giving us first the shared gift and goal of perceiving. In this second lecture, I want to return to this shared gift and goal of perceiving the living world together and consider what it means to know and hold that gift and goal and what it has meant to live and create, live and build in ignorance or even refusal of it. The aim of this second lecture is to rethink what the perceiving by the creature means for dwelling. Now, dwelling as I am using it here in this lecture is both noun and verb. As noun, I am referring to the making of habitation and of other things. And as verb, I am referring to the movement toward communion and a life of perceptual reciprocity, dwelling that moves us toward communion. We believe that the God of Israel is our God and their God, and that has changed everything. We believe that the God of Israel is our God and their God, and that has changed everything. This statement, made implicitly by Jew and Gentile alike in the aftermath of the death and resurrection of Jesus and the coming of the creating Spirit upon their bodies, was much more than claiming that Yahweh is Elohim, and far more than walking a path from the particular to the universal. This was sight work, the work of seeing freshly and the work of going to new and different sights to see freshly into the living world. We had been placed on the path to become second readers, a reading after that, if done faithfully, would transform us and begin to shape us into homemakers together. Yet this was a path not taken, and because it was not taken, it left us with three pedagogical shortcomings. Three things that remain undercultivated in Christian thought and practice in relation to creation, and thereby not significantly present in our articulating of Christian belief in a creator or in our doctrines of creation. First, we don't know how to move in God's new beginnings. Jew and Gentiles were placed between the improbable and the impossible and shown new life. We live always between the improbable and the impossible, called by the Spirit of God to journey together into the new that God can create. But cultivating a shared practice of envisioning and forming life in the new has been a troubled reality for us. From the ways we understand and articulate salvation to the ways we build structure, build habitation, build life. We are the inheritors of legacies of destructive newness that eradicates life and has rendered the claim that God creates new beginnings a form of bad faith for so many. Those legacies had shown us to be peoples of faith who struggle to know how to envision and create the new together. For example, new forms of living, new forms of habitation, and new processes of cultivating life that work against death, even at the sites, sites, the sites of death. Indeed, knowing how to work against death at the sites of death remains an elusive skill for Christians. Secondly, we don't know how to imagine an assimilation that heals rather than harms. The Spirit aimed Jew and Gentile toward life inside one another, inside the patterns of living, ways of loving, and a faith that would join stories and not eradicate them or collapse them into a strange and sick sameness. Yet the possibilities of such living required a risk of faith not fathomed by those ancient, tense disciples of Jesus. They were faced with the challenge of articulating a hermeneutic of divine love for all of creation in the specifics of peoples and their ways of life, while also articulating a hermeneutics of idolatry and the banishment of other gods with the tyrannies and obligations they promote. Yet here the Spirit of God could lead into new beginnings for both Jew and Gentile if only they would yield to the Spirit. Instead, an assimilationist Gentile Christianity emerged, stripped of its health and hope for real dwelling, and in denial of the full power of shared beginnings. Thirdly, we don't know how to sense the sensing of others. A healthy practice of assimilation yields a lively practice of sensing together, born of the desire made concrete to carefully attend to the shape of life for one another. Jews and Gentiles were being invited by the Spirit of God into a scene of one another and into the scene of one another in a new light as sites of the Spirit's presence and destinations of divine love. What lay ahead for them were the meals. What lay ahead for them were the meals, the breaking of bread together, and with it, the cooking, and with it, the gathering, and with it, the hunting, and with it, the looking and seeing and listening to the specifics of the world, the specifics of worlds. Jews and Gentiles together being introduced to new animals and their peoples, new plants, new trees, new bodies of waters, and peoples claimed by them all as kin, as close, as skin. Moving in God's new beginnings, practicing life-giving assimilation, and sensing with the sensing of others, these skills present the path not taken by Christians even as they confessed that God is the creator of all that is. Yet, This uncultivated path does not mean an absent path. It has always been there, my friends, running alongside the path that Christianity did take, especially evident when we enter the waters of colonial modernity from the 15th century forward. Now, I cannot in the space of a single lecture touch all the contours of the path that Western Christianity especially took from the colonial moment forward. But I will consider one particular turn that was decisive for us and the ways we understand the work of creating and dwelling, the reality of a creation and ourselves as creatures. That turn may be captured by one word: possession. Possession. The idea of possession is as ancient as is social life for plants and animals and humans. But from the beginning of the modern colonial era in the 15th century, it formed freshly through a new way of looking at the world, emerging from shifts in Christian thought and practice. The world became possession in an absolute sense. What the great historian William Cronin noted in his classic text, Changes in the Land, what he noted about the Native Americans of New England during the 17th century, could be said about indigenous peoples' much earlier encounter with European colonialists. They found themselves surrounded by people who had a strange new way of thinking possession. These invading European Christians saw possession through break, separation, and enclosure. Break, separation, and enclosure, where native groups saw possession through continuum, connection, overlap. Continuum, connection, overlap. The former, a possession of; the latter, a possession by. The former made a claim on something. The latter was claimed by something. Now, this is no small difference, because between these two ways of imagining possession, one world is being destroyed, and another world is being created. The indigenous world being destroyed articulated claims to things inside the logic of a commons, but not a commons in the sense of early Europeans to the New World, who imagined the commons as small islands of shared land and a sea of feudal holdings. This indigenous commons, if you will, is everywhere. And each people may have a claim to this or that place to hunt or gather food or celebrate or deliberate or listen to the ancestors and or the animal kin. This common touches tools for use in a logic of sharing and touches bodies in shared concern. It also involves a kind of reciprocity with animals, plants, and seasons, each requiring attentiveness and respect. Now, it does not preclude violence or theft or dispute over lands or oppression. It narrates such horrors when narrations are given through violations of the commons and attacks on communal or even covenantal bonds. The world being created by the colonialists articulated claims to things inside the logic of control. Most historians of these periods and decolonial theorists see this as a logic of commerce. They are correct, but short-sighted, because commerce follows control, and control has to do with making my world manageable, understandable, and containable, with trying to grasp creation. These are the terms through which to see the long deployment of European pastoral practices and agricultural sensibilities in the New World. It was those practices and sensibilities that shaped their aggressive reformatting of the landscape of the New World and determined their assessment of native life. The colonial settlers reached two ominous conclusions about native life in the land. First, native peoples did not know how to cultivate specific lands to make them productive. That is, they did not know how to properly farm or build habitat. And secondly, they should be seen in possession of only those lands that were being cultivated and improved. The cultivation and improvement of the land reached all the way to the body, as indigenous peoples the world over were being forced to live inside constraining visions of ownership. The philosopher John Locke summarized this way of thinking in his second treatise on government, where he captured the colonialist sense of possession. In his discussion of property, Locke offered an elegant argument for private property and the taking of land. He said, whether we understand it through reason or revelation, God has given to us the world as a resource, as our possession in common. He said, just as we claim ourselves as our first property, so too God commands that we claim this world. That claim over body and land is enacted, he said, through labor. We work through our bodies to live, and we work the land for the same purpose. It is labor, he said, that gives life to our claims to life in specific places. As Locke says, and I quote, thus labor in the beginning gave a right of property wherever anyone was pleased to employ it upon what was common, unquote. Locke, in fact, writes of two beginnings. The beginning of God's creation, as he says, described in Genesis, and the beginning of private property that emanates out of the commons. The human creature may create through labor what God created through grace. The human creature may create through labor what God created through grace, life indwelling, and life in dwelling. For Locke, anyone who labors may extend their self-possession to possession of land and creation of place, and thereby establish their own self-possession. This is what indigenous peoples did not understand, according to Locke. They did not understand the cultivation and improvement, and in our words today, the development of the land, and therefore they did not understand how to cultivate themselves. Thus, he says, and I quote, in the beginning, all the world was America. More importantly, he says they cannot claim all of America as their own because it is common, given by God, and only labor secures it to any individual or people. Locke believes he's on solid moral ground because he argues that no one can claim more than a person can use. No hoarding, unless you plan to sell what you produce. Then you may, in his words, enlarge your possessions, as long as you are turning it toward productivity. Both slaves and indigenous peoples came to understand under the modern colonialist regimes that possession connected body to land, and it operationalized one's right to exist and one's freedom. To claim oneself was to possess oneself, and to claim your existence as a people required you lay claim to some piece of land as the space for your cultivation and your productivity. Through this vision of possession, ownership and existence were coupled together and made a crucial foundational aspect of self-determination and self-expression. Like land thought through possession, self-possession yields a limited imaginative range. Either own yourself and your labor, or someone else will possess you and your labor and your voice. Of course, I am already, in fact, touching on the broad contours of a global struggle that has been with us in earnest since the founding colonial moment, as peoples all over the globe are fighting within and against nation states and corporations for self-determination of life and land. As the great philosopher and biologist Vandana Shiva so eloquently argues in her work, that women in the majority world are in a life and death struggle over both the seed of their bodies and the seeds in the ground. Yet Locke's thinking gives witness to the horror of a Christian doctrine of creation that is formed along this bad path. Now, let me be clear. Locke did not formulate a full-blown doctrine of creation. He simply operated in one that begins without shared perception. He, like the many Christians before and after him, envisioned creation unattached. We see creation, but we do not see people seeing creation. And we do not sense creation through people's sensing of creation. And we do not sense creation sensing us. We see creation, but we do not see different peoples seeing creation. We do not sense creation through different people's sensing of creation. And we do not sense creation in all its manifold diversity, sensing us, sensing through us. Our seeing, that is our reading of the creation, is formed in isolation and fosters isolation. Indeed, such a way of isolation, of isolated reading, remains a signature of Christian doctrines of creation. We even read Genesis in ways that banish Israel as co-reader. The ways we articulate the doctrine of creation and the ways we read and interpret Genesis would exist exactly as they do, even if Israel did not exist. An isolated sight of creation is bound to an isolated reading of Genesis. Now, our problem shows itself in our procedures for writing doctrines of creation and interpreting Genesis, and it reveals absent practices of sensing and knowing with other peoples, and thereby living and learning of God's creation with them. Locke's thinking not only showed an isolated and isolating perception of the world, but it also showed a path toward death. A path that has led us to not seeing the creation as animate and communicative. What emerged as the relentless processes of objectification and commodification began with the failure to listen to how other peoples listen to and interact with animals and landscapes, sea and trees, flora and rock. Historically, we could lodge this in a Gentile assimilating church that took hold of the anti-idolatry optic of Israel without the necessary skills of discernment in its proper use, and without the ongoing shared work of discerning the new life together that God was forming between Jew and Gentile. Yet the path would lead us away from the mediation of revelation. That is, it would lead us away from a God who wills to reveal the density of a listening and responding world through the peoples of the world. A world that listens and responds to the living God, and a people that is able, peoples who are able to listen to a world that is listening. The path we took moved us away from what anthropologist and philosopher Eduardo Kahn calls the living semiosis of the world, the way in which plant and animal, land and landscape, sea and sky in specific environments communicate to us and through us, and the good work of being aligned with it, with that communication. We have gloried in a path that turned the world into an object of use and an object of study. Now, let me be clear. Use and study are not the problems. The problems come in the ways they have been framed for us. They have been framed inside of use value and the coupling of knowledge and ownership for the sake of mastery. That framing justifies the objectification of use and study according to the results they yield. We've gone a long way down this path, my friends, a long way down this path, until this path has become the commodity chain itself. We now inhabit a Christianity aligned with the commodity form and at ease with the legacies of objectification. Locke did not create this path. I say it again, Locke did not create this path. He simply shows a Christian vision of creation moving along this path and pulling indigenous peoples and those who would be colonized along the way and setting up a struggle for those who would be Christian against the creation that this isolating Christianity perceived. There has always been a struggle inside a struggle. There has always been a struggle inside a struggle. There has always been a struggle inside the struggle against colonialism and all its legacies. A struggle inside the struggle against white supremacy and heteronormative visions of what is true, what is good, what is beautiful, what is noble, what is normal. There has always been a struggle inside the struggle against the vast stratagems of exploitation of all living things and the forms of exchange and commerce built upon those exploitive stratagems. That inner struggle, my friends, that inner struggle is the struggle against misperception of creation itself and misperception of ourselves as creatures. Yet, to get at that misperception and to engage in this struggle inside the struggle requires we consider the reality of dwelling. That is, the ways in which we make habitation and other things that solidify our misperceiving and the ways we thwart the trajectory of dwelling toward communion and a life of perceptual reciprocity. The creature is called by God to home. The creature is called by God to creating home and becoming home. And to answer that calling means we take to the path not taken. Not by hoping to go back, but by going forward into new beginnings, going forward into a new reality of assimilation, going forward into a new sensing. So allow me to draw this lecture toward an end by asking a set of questions that turn us forward. First, how do we begin again? How do we begin again? I am not asking how do we start over. I am asking how do we create beginnings together? How do we challenge the legacies of destructive newness of body and place, of ways of living and forms of habitation that have been and continue to be done in the name of our God, or for the sake of the so-called common good, or in alignment with visions of development? There remains, for the people of God, a call to remember that we live always between the improbable and the impossible, opening ourselves to the new that the Spirit of the living God seeks to create in and through us. That newness always works against death at the sites where death seeks to take life. Yet, remember, my friends, the first tactic of death is to isolate and to draw us to imagine life and our lives in isolation. So dreaming a future and building a future in isolation from others, from the full voice of others, has always been a signature of the success, of the victory of death. This is precisely how so many European colonialists, merchants, missionaries, and soldiers, made themselves agents of death precisely when they imagined themselves to be building the new. And the new continues to be built. Habitations and communities and towns and cities and ways of life in ways that announce the reign of death. We must seek ways to gather that create the conditions to create together. I'll say that again. We must seek ways to gather that create the conditions to create together. We must aim again to cultivate the ability to cultivate life even at the sites of death. Secondly, how do we enter without invading? How do we touch one another without turning again toward the protocols of conquest? These questions point to the painful path Christians took and yet remain on in many tragic ways. Often our responses to the history of Christian invasion and Christian conquest and Christian forced assimilation has been equally tragic by turning us toward practices of segregation and an imagination that cannot fathom intimate life together across border and boundary existence. The work of shared building and dreaming, of creating the new, means a new kind of laboring together, which would be a working of life for the sake of our shared thriving. From the colonial moment forward, labor emerged as both a way to assimilate and segregate at the same time. That labor of place and person formed a world that constantly seeks to drain our energy to imagine new forms of collectivity, of diverse life together inside shared projects of living. Race, nation, and corporation. Race, nation, and corporation present exhausted forms of collectivity that thwart our desire to imagine an assimilation that heals. Assimilation. Even the word sounds ominous and life-draining, and so it should, given the formation of Christianity inside its horror rather than its hope. The hope we should have is for an embodied providence. The hope we should have is for an embodied providence of God becoming flesh and leading us into the divine life and showing us the divine life in and with us. This providence, this embodied providence invites us to read forward the will of God for the creature and all of creation. No doctrine of providence that doesn't teach us how to read forward is worth being called providence. To read forward the will of God for the creature and for the creation, a joining that awaits us and even now is in the works and in the working. Finally, how do we sense? How do we turn to the sensing? How do we step again onto the path of discernment? There remains for the disciples of Jesus a Trinitarian attentiveness. A Trinitarian attentiveness to the world where we are following the Spirit of the living God into the intimate places of the living world. A disciple of Jesus pays attention. A disciple of Jesus pays attention, and through and in that attending, the Spirit speaks and opens our senses to the good creation and to all the ways that the good creation is being threatened by evil. Cultivating discernment is also cultivating an attunement to the world and the ways peoples are attuned to the world. We have inherited a legacy of turning discernment against attunement. A legacy of turning discernment against attunement, born of the failure to weave together a hermeneutics of love with a hermeneutics of idolatry, a hermeneutics of love with a hermeneutics of idolatry. Too quickly, we have aligned what God loves and what God hates with an impatient sensing, and have thereby confused what God loves with what God hates. My friends, this is the unfinished work ahead of us, to build freshly the sensing and to enter fully the discerning for the sake of the creation and the work of building life together. So, a doctrine must be unframed. A doctrine of creation must be unframed so that it might be reframed, so that a way of perceiving the world and building in this world might be undone, so that it might be redone and the building might begin afresh, and together we might become home. I will end with a poem from my most recent book, After Whiteness, entitled Building New Babel. Let's try this again, but now with noise, a cacophony of voices that none of us can control. We need that destroying God who made all of this happen, threw away our plans, and sat down in our midst. You, God, speak to each of us. We can now only speak through you to one another and understand what and how to build with what stone, which wood, whose cloth, whose hand, which eye, whose feet, which arm, every mind, each hope, climbing higher. Nothing will be wasted. No one will be thrown away. Then we will say to one as one, we have built together only what you wanted, what we desired to see. You in your home. Thank you very much.